The thing I learned from Bill Schnee was, I don't know if he's ever said this, but I've always learned from him, which is just trust low end. Like, trust the bass. It's going to be, okay. I never saw him do an aggressive amount of EQ on bass guitar, but he always had the absolute most low end out of anything I've ever heard when it came to bass.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by SonarWorks, helping you get the most out of your mixes by correcting the sound of the speakers and headphones in your studio so you get your mix right the first time. Are you sick of doing multiple mixes and still you can't get the low end right? How would it feel to have badass bass the first time? Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com. Are you ready to rock the perfect mix? This episode is sponsored by OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey Rockstars, this is Lij Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Marc Daniel Nelson, a Grammy-nominated music producer, mixing engineer, and 4-time PMA-nominated and 1-time winner. He's been producing, mixing, and managing creatives for over 18 years. His music credits include Fleetwood Mac, Jason Mraz, Colbie Caillat, Eric Burdon, Robert Duvall, Marc Bussard, Ozomotli, Reik, and more. As a protege for both legendary producer Bill Schnee and Ken Caillat, Marc has carried the torch for impeccable quality sound and production. His film credits include Solo, The Vietnam War, Blade Runner, Wild Horses, Point Break, No Manches Frida, Father Figures, and more. His creative management credits include executive producing the 13-episode PBS television series, creating and executive producing the national video campaign for Guitar Center, creative directing for Alcon Sleeping Giant and ArtistMax. Marc has also been showcased on the cover of Audio Solutions magazine, in addition to articles in Mix Online, Shore, and Business Magazine. In fact, he was chosen for the 20 Under 40 award by Business Magazine for his entrepreneurial work. Very cool. I'm really excited to have Marc on the show to talk about producing, recording, and mixing for music and picture. Please welcome Marc Daniel Nelson to Recording Studio Rockstars. Marc, are you ready to rock?
I am ready. Is that what you're supposed to say?
Yeah, man. You say it however you want. I mean, you've got the deep, warm U67, or no, the U87 there. So you can say it in the deep voice if you want to.
Yo, I am ready. I'm ready.
How would you say it if you were, one of the voices from Solo, for example?
Oh, I'm ready.
There you go. Awesome.
You like that?
I like it very much, man. Do you actually do any voice work in any of your production?
No.
You should, man.
I'm too shy.
Nice. Well, so, I've kind of read an introduction. A lot of that comes from your own bio as well. Tell us more briefly about who you are, where you are, and tell us about your studio, The Alley.
Well, I am Marc Daniel Nelson, not Marc Nelson from Boyz II Men. I had to put a middle name in there years back because Marc Nelson, one of the singers from Boyz II Men, was getting all my credits. So that's how that came to be. I'm currently in Salt Lake City. I've been here for about a year working with Warner Chappell, doing a bunch of score music and stuff for television and movies and stuff. but came from LA. I was there on and off for almost 10 years and grew up in Chicago. And I miss it. I miss Chicago.
Yeah, you spent time at CRC, didn't you?
I started there in late 99, or maybe it was early 2000 as an intern. And then I was an assistant for a little while. And then I moved on. Probably 2002, I moved on.
I think I was at CRC just before you started. We spent.
Were you working there?
Yeah, well, I was working with a band called the Trixo that was out of Chicago, and we had finished their album, and we had to get it from Pro Tools to Sony 24 or 48 track, I think it was, digital.
The Dash Machine.
Yeah, to the Dash Machine. So we spent an all-nighter in there just like unraveling our Pro Tools session and fitting it onto 48 tracks of digital somehow. I think we made a mess of it, but it all worked out in the end.
I was going to say, when I started, they had rental Pro Tools systems. And one of the only reasons probably why I was pulled out of the intern pit was because of knowing Pro Tools just enough to run it as a Pro Tools operator. And I don't even remember if they didn't even get they were renting rigs even up till Zwan. I remember they had to rent a couple rigs at that time, or maybe they bought them for Zwan, because I remember Billy rented out both Studio 4 and 5 for like 6 months, both rooms. So I think they might have just bought those systems then. So it's just interesting you say before then. I'm going, wow, that was a long time ago. Do you remember who you worked with there?
No, I forgot. I mean, I was mostly, I think, running it myself. Maybe we had an assistant, but this would have been like 99, I think.
That's super cool.
So just before you were there. But I remember CRC being a very cool studio. Chicago's a great place. We've had some great guests on the show from Chicago. How long were you in Chicago, and where did you go after that?
Well, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up outside of the city in a town called Valpo, and that's about 38 minutes outside the city. And then I moved into the city when I started working at CRC. And then after that, I decided I should go. It's funny, it's 19 years later. And my first day at CRC, everyone was trying to tell me to leave this industry, to get out. My first day, all of it was just, why are you doing this? Why are you here? And I just remember going, okay, that's my fuel. I guess I was just at Blackbird 2 weeks ago talking to the Academy, and my biggest note was use that no as your yes.
Yeah.
Because even 19 years ago, through my entire life, everyone's always said no. And I've always used that as the biggest thing. I think Ed Cherney said once, we were talking about the state of the industry and how hard it is to become a recording engineer. And he said, I think it's harder to be it's easier to be an astronaut than it is a successful recording engineer. And there's something to that always rang in my head, which meant if I can do this legitimately, then I'm better than anything. Then I could be better, then it would make more sense to me to do that than to make $500,000 as a banker or something like that. I would never have fun doing that. So after I worked at CRC for a while, I worked out of a couple studios, Wall to Wall, which was this really cool studio downtown. There was a few others. And then I made a decision to go to Columbia Film and just put my focus into directing and editing. And I went and got my bachelor's there while I managed a smaller studio called Bear Tracks.
And Columbia is the college in Chicago, right?
Yeah, Columbia is the film school in Chicago.
They also have a great recording program, I think.
They do. They've got some pretty amazing teachers. Chris Brickley, I think, is still teaching there, same as Dan Dietrich. And these two guys Chris Brickley is just unbelievable. He's done everything, all the R. Kelly stuff in the past. And he engineered Yankee Hotel Foxtrot by Wilco and all these amazing records. So it's really cool. And Dan Dietrich, he did all the Red Wall stuff and a bunch of the stuff from Wall to Wall. And I believe they're both still teaching there, which is really good that having these guys that are actually killer at what they do teach young guys how to do stuff. I mean, it's just one of those things that, I went to school in Ohio, and it was a very different time. It was, recording workshop. It wasn't like now where there's all these divisions of recording schools and all these amazing opportunities to go online and find all these, tricks you can on YouTube. There was none of that, none. And the biggest thing was just to take up everything I could. There wasn't even videos out there of recording. I think the very first video that I saw out there, which was Russ Long's video that he did. I was talking to him that day at lunch about that. I said, I think you had one of the very first education videos at the time.
Do you remember what it was?
It was his video. It was recording Nashville or something he had at his studio. And it was and you can still find clips online with it, but it was really thorough stuff. And at that time, I was an assistant or an intern at these amazing sessions at CRC. You really didn't understand the concept. It was really hard unless you spent years mentoring under somebody to understand what was going on. And to have that education outside of, at least for my world, I mean, I come from a world that my learning process was always different than mostly other kids. I had a hard time reading manuals, and it took me a while to kind of sit and go over things over and over until it buried it in my head. And, just having this kind of video stuff in the beginning was killer, because I could just turn it around, rewind it, watch it again, really get into it.
Well, so I was just going to comment. You made the comment about don't take no, or, you get a lot of no's and that was your fuel. I remember feeling that way too, that, I had this thought. I was like, yeah, just don't take no for an answer. So it's kind of nice to hear it confirmed from you as well.
I've spent so many years trying to prove to myself that this was the best decision for me. And I kind of run off the internal opinion. That was the one thing I've been able to, I just don't listen to anybody but myself when it comes to my feelings and what my goals are.
Yeah.
Obviously there's people like my influences and my mentors in my life that are crafting that, but mainly, you got to trust your internal clock and your internal instinct of what you're trying to achieve. And I didn't know what my destiny was going to be. I didn't know. I was not really doing it for power or money. I was a songwriter, and I sang in a band, and I was always had pretty good success with that. And everyone was like, "Why aren't you pursuing that?" And I said, "Because I don't want to do that. I like doing it, but I'm more, I don't know, making records has always been way more magical than the other side." Yeah. So it was once I kind of clicked into that, nothing mattered. So when I was failing, which I did a lot of, it never felt like I was failing and maybe, I don't know, maybe I just trusted life too hard, but it took a long time for something to become steady. When I was working as a intern into an assistant at CRC, there was a lot of guys that were just locked in and they had security right away. And I never felt like I had that in the beginning. And then when I went to film school, I didn't feel like I had it either, because it just, I don't know, I was hungry all the time. So, which took me to, after I graduated at Columbia, I was still managing a recording studio and doing records and stuff. And that's how I kind of lived and paid for school and stuff. And I thought, what am I going to do? I already did Chicago. There was records going on at that time that were exciting, but things were starting to shift. Rock was starting to change just a little bit, and the projects weren't nearly as exciting as I was hoping them to be or wanting them to be anymore. I was starting to lose that nostalgic feeling of magic. Mm-hmm. And I've said, okay, I'm either going to go to Nashville or I'm going to go to LA. And I actually went to Nashville while working on this project. My mentor, who I owe everything to, David Abshire, he worked on this record with me for about 5 years. It was basically my opportunity to experiment with funding. This guy was amazing personality. He has super successful kids, and everything that he taught me was a direct course of how I would make my decisions. And we made record doing that. And I was going to go to Nashville and maybe have someone master it. And the first time I went down to Nashville, I was close with one of my best friends still, who was in a very successful band called 363. And he showed me Nashville at that time. It was early, maybe 2004. And I liked it, but it almost felt too similar to Chicago. It wasn't, foreign enough for me. I was like, if I'm going to do this, I've got to really throw myself out there. And then fast forward, I think a year, we were finishing up this album, and I called Doug Sax up to master it. And he answered the phone, and I was no one. And he just talked to me for a half hour about the weather and about Chicago and about food. And I was just like beside myself because I couldn't believe this is the grandfather of mastering, the most secure, successful, every record I loved, Doug Sax did, that just wants to talk to me. And I said, just on a whim, I'm going to fly out and I'm going to play the record. And he's like, great. When are you coming out? And I just, oh, okay, great. Jeez. Okay. So I took the record out. It was a record that took a while to produce. It was very Pink Floyd. It was very Sting. It was concept record. And I had it really organized. I had everything in a folder in the binder, and I played the record all the way through, and it was in this binder that you could flip through and see exactly what was what. And I was there and played it to Doug and Sonny, who was Doug's second at that time. And he's like, who's going to mix this? And I said, well, I was planning on it. I don't know. We were just going to probably just get it mastered. And he's looking at Sonny, and he's like, Bill should do this. And I'm like, I'm not listening because I always never listen. I have horrible ADD. And I'm like, wait, I didn't hear that. What did you say? He's like, Bill Schnee should mix this. And Bill Schnee, to me at that time, was one of my favorites. So, the guy started his career with Huey Lewis and all these people. He didn't start his career, but Huey's career started working with Bill and stuff like that. Huge influence off those records. And, engineered The Bodyguard and Steely Dan records. And he was one of the only guys that ever worked with all of the Beatles after they worked out. It's just this magnitude of the success this guy had, and his Sonic's character was so huge in what I was trying to achieve out of life. I felt like I hit a max, and I was trying to look for the next best thing. And I'm just like, absolutely. Okay, whatever, because I didn't think he's kidding me. He's not going to be able to, we can't afford him. And I was driving back down from Ojai, and Bill called me, and he's like, what are you doing right now? And I'm like, driving through Hollywood. I was heading back downtown before downtown was actually a good place to live. It was like Armageddon down there at that time.
But I knew Doug Sax was in LA at that time, or that's where he was. He had his mastering lab, which was in Hollywood, but he also had his shop up in Ojai, which is where I drove up to. I see.
And I stopped over at Schnee's, and we talked, and he was incredibly gracious, and I was absolutely shaking the whole time. I think Abe Jr. just did a session right when I was leaving, who's Paul McCartney's drummer. So I had this just sense of what on world, this is incredible. And you get in there, and there's just hundreds of gold and platinum records on the wall. And it was just like, when you're young, I think I was 24. I was just, this is it. I already did CRC. I worked with a lot of really, well-known people and stuff, but this felt way different. This felt like the big league. And he's like, I'll do it, whatever you guys come up with. And then, so I went back to Chicago and, asked my mentor, I said, he wants to do this. We can't say no. And we worked out this incredible deal, and he mixed it. And then I was just wrapping up a project, and we were mastering for recalls. So we did our recalls at Bill's, and then we went up to Ojai to have it mastered. And at that time, Eric Boulanger, who is now one of my best friends, just started. He left Capitol as their first intern and just started working under Bill. And he was the youngest guy I knew out of all of them. I think Bruce Botnick was there that day. I think Al Schmidt called on the phone. It was just a really magical place to be at that day. We went to lunch, and it was just this amazing conversations about Pink Floyd and all these stories Doug would fill in. And I said, this is insane. How do I get into this? And I remember going to bed at the hotel, and I had a flight the next day, and I'm like, I called Bill. I said, can I talk to you? And I didn't even know what I was going to say. And he's like, yeah. And I went in there and I just said, I want to come work for you. I don't know what I want to do. I just want to work underneath you. I'll do anything. And he's like, okay, when are you getting here? It was that fast.
That's so cool.
And I'm just like, 3 weeks. So I went, flew home, packed my car, and moved to Los Angeles. And I stuck next to Bill as long as I could and learned every finger lifting trick he could come up with. Even the stuff, I'm very close to him now, but I bring up stuff now that he didn't even realize he was teaching because he does everything on autopilot, at least a lot of it. And it's just, it was the most insane portion of my life I can remember. That was the most important amount of education and lessons to learn critical listening and understanding the philosophy of what Doug Sachs and Bill Schnee and a handful of other people follow. The philosophy of, does it sound good? And the critical listening took forever because I left Chicago liking one style of music, and I came back liking something else based off of sonics. So
that's such a great thing about making records is as you dig into it, you get this chance to completely, wipe out what you thought was your musical taste sometimes.
All I can say is at any given moment for anyone that's listening, you're never too old or you don't have enough experience to never mentor and latch on to people on how they do things. I mean, even to this day, I still call as many people as I can and talk to anybody that I can about the passion behind mixing and engineering and the philosophy of tools we can use in creating songs and understanding songwriting purpose and the emotion of the human nature of what songs really do and why frequencies can balance your head and make you feel different feelings. And it's just, you just got to always be a leech and always suck it up.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Can you remember maybe like 3 things top of mind that you remember learning from Bill early on?
Oh man, I don't know where to go. I mean, the biggest thing is less is always more. I could give that advice. It just seemed that, and a lot of these times I would always, over the last 12 years, I would tell Bill, you taught me this thing. And he's like, I don't even know if I taught you that. And I'm like, well, maybe you did, but you didn't realize it. And maybe I'm just saying it wrong, but this is how I've taken it. And it's helped me. So my philosophies might be a little different than what they've said, but a lot of it is less is more, in my opinion. Like you can get away with a lot. You do not need, sounds terrible, but you don't need a massive amount of toys to achieve what you're trying to do.
Right.
And in fact, the more electronics you put into a signal, a lot of people like color, and that's cool. But, I've learned that the bigger the sound, the more impressive it is. So when I'm mixing a song now for clients, if I'm in a mix shootout with a couple other mixers, some I actually know who they are, my achieving goal is to make it bigger than theirs. And luckily, being a mixer in that field now, I can actually hear what they've already done. And I can balance my mind after I get what I need out of it to make it bigger. And a lot of that came from just clean signal, cleaner the better. It has nothing to do with sterile. It has nothing to do with that kind of stuff. I'm a huge fan of tubes, massive amount. But I found that like the less that's in a chain, the bigger it's going to come out, which is kind of pushed me into the in the box world hardcore over the last 4 years, because you're getting a way different world that it takes a very long time. And I think, Andrew Sheps is probably one of the first people to admit it, that once you get it down, you're in and it's the game on. I mean, I've talked about that a handful of times at a couple schools I've talked at and stuff, which is I've been there against, doesn't mean I'm a better mixer, but I've been there against the universe's biggest mixers that mix fully analog, and I've won for big albums, strictly in
Nice.
the box. And I love toys. I love analog compressors. I love tube compressors. I like all that stuff. I love old German tube microphones. But at the same time, I've found that once you start understanding the critical listening side of things, you can kind of achieve as much as you can by faking it. And of course, now working in the box and having so many options and plugins, you can really, really get some really cool creative things. And I'm sure everyone has said this. It doesn't even matter if it sounds like analog or it sounds like it was mixed on a Neve console. I don't care about that anymore.
Right.
I like colors like that, but at the same time, I don't care how I get that color. So I'm fine if the plugin sounds exactly what I'm trying to get out of it.
Yeah.
And I'm the kind of guy that will use drum samples specifically because I know instantly I can get exactly what I need instantly out of it by not doing loads and loads of EQ and compression in parallel and trying to get this 30-minute explosive thing going on, and then it didn't work out the way I had it in my head. I can just pop on a snare. I know exactly what I want, and just augment that. So I'd say critical listening, less is more, and no limits, no rules. There is no way in 2018 going into 2019 that it matters that you can cut your record in a basement with an Apollo, which, oh my gosh, it's just like every time I work with artists now that have been using the Apollo, it's always like, wow, this sounds great. Can't believe it. Oh, holy crap. So it's pretty exciting where things are going.
It's gotten a lot of recommendations on the podcast. Actually, the Apollo is one of the most listed interfaces. So that's always encouraging to hear. But I think you're the first person to describe it as when somebody's project that started out on an Apollo makes it to you, you can just tell right away that it's got a head start when it's time to mix.
The trick thing is, so I do a ton of different types of mixing. So there's label-based stuff that people are still tracking in real studios. Those are exciting. Those are more of like the fusion jazz or just the traditional jazz or blues or something that, you need a real room and the real analog console to do. Mm-hmm. And even to that point, I get crap that's done in really good rooms that are just like, oh gosh, they tried so hard to compress the tape and do everything they could. And by the time it got to me, I was going backwards. But then there's this band, Ken Caillat and I produced Painted Horses. They have an album coming out that we recorded at Prairie Sun last year. And he's working on new songs and he's doing everything on his Apollo with the same drummer and the same bass player and him. And I'm just like, holy crap, this sounds, I almost want to be like, I don't think we need to re-record any of this because it's killer. It's just really amazing getting stuff in. And now that they're making them in smaller things, you can travel with them. And there's a bass player I'm about ready to work with that is, I think he's over in Asia right now. And he's able to do a bunch of tracks for me in his hotel room on I think, either a Scarlett or Apollo or something like that. And it's just awesome that you can do that. And I don't know if I even care anymore that he's not going through real iron or, some kind of philosophy. It's got to hit a transformer now and got to use this and better hit a tube. Yeah. I don't even care about that anymore.
It's amazing what you can do after the fact too, as long as you get a good capture at the beginning.
Exactly.
So maybe talk more about working with Ken Caillat and how you guys met and some of the things you learned from working with him.
Sure. So after I'm trying to think when that was. So I got a call from a friend / artist I worked with back in Valparaiso, and he wanted to build a studio, and I was still working for Schnee at the time, just in Los Angeles. And I'm like, okay, well, if I go back to Chicago, what will bring me back? And the studio that he was building, which was the Alley at the time, he kept saying yes to everything. That's a big thing in my life. I go off of yes and no. So if they say no, I'm still going to do it. It just might take me longer. But if I can't find a no, it's always going to be a yes, which is, a big, easy way to get around and navigate in life. So he said yes to all these things. I'm like, we should have this. Yes. We should do this. Yes. Can we do this? Yes. So I'm going, oh my gosh, this is perfect. I just spent all this time, learning everything I could, and it's time for me to finally put it together and put the studio together. So we built the alley, and it was great. It was pretty successful right off the bat. I think we had like blackout for 3 weeks right away on the very first session, and it was from a group in LA that I got to bring back, and that helped. And it was good to be back home with my parents, and my uncle just passed away, and he was like my second dad, so I want to be close to my family. And that went on for about 7 years. I would go back to LA quite often, just to be there and work on stuff, be with friends, hang out with Bill, be close to my buddy Eric, who was just getting into mastering at the mastering lab. He was starting to actually do that. He was chief engineer for a while, doing all the technical stuff. But then he started cutting records, and I always wanted to send him everything I did. And we did pretty good at the alley. And then I pitched PBS this show concept, which was, at that time, there wasn't a lot of that out there. There was, I think the DSLR camera just got kind of popular, the 5D, but it was still pretty expensive to be able to do like in-studio live recordings and stuff. So I pitched PBS to put funding out for a 13-episode series in Chicago. And they said yes. And we did 26 bands, 2 bands per episode. And they were 30-minute episodes on these bands in the studio. And, it's a little mini documentary. And it went really well. And that kind of opened doors in other ways. And it was amazing advertising for the studio. And that kind of worked itself out. And then during that time, I think Eric was starting to work on records, and I think he mastered and maybe even mixed 1 or 2 songs for Colbie Caillat at that time. And I always was, it killed me, because I always wanted, like, geez, how did you, I got to get out there. I need to get back to LA. I want to get into that environment. I want to hang out with Ken. I want to figure all this stuff out. And at that time, I didn't know Ken at all. And I think we did something in 2008 or 9. I can't even remember. But the friendship started really kind of short for a year or two while I still lived in the city. And it wasn't until I moved back to LA in 2014 that it worked, because the alley was just at this place where things were really going well. And we got a phone call saying the building's being bought, just like everywhere now. 2014, the building's being bought. It's being torn down for condos. Okay.
Oh, man.
Okay. So we just got everything in line. We're doing very well. Now we have to leave. And I started thinking to myself, I'm not going to rebuild a studio in Chicago. It's just not going to happen in 2014. It's a very silly decision. I'm going to move back to LA. So I moved back. I had some work going on at the time. I was working on an album in LA with a band. And I think I was just going to have lunch with Ken. At that time, I said, I'm going to come by and have lunch. And he's like, come by. And he was at the Village because he had a room, an E at the Village, locked out for 5 or 6 years before then. He's had it for a long time there. And we never went to lunch. They were working on a film. I can't even remember what the film was. I think it was the James Franco, Robert Duvall film. And they were playing some music on it. And Michael Hodges was Ken's partner at the time. And Ken's like, I forget what happened. It was just really easily like a fun day. I didn't care about lunch. And clearly he was more excited about getting something done for work because they were stuck on something. And I think the suggestion was made to do something. And I stayed there running Pro Tools the rest of the day. And I ended up becoming Ken's main engineer till today. I mean, we just did this thing. Marc Bussard just did this track with Ken, and we're mixing it right now. But that started the whole, bonding thing. Because at that time, I mean, I knew Ken and I was close to him, but I didn't feel like I was like locked into him. It was, really intimidating to get into that headspace. And, that came over the years. And then it's funny now, overlooking everything, it's like he was one of the few guys, him and Schnee were the two guys. That's why I got into where I got. Not only why I was able to make it, but why I wanted to do it. Rumors was my favorite album. The Beatles are my kings, but there was always the second, and the second was just as great, and that was Fleetwood Mac. And Rumors had the best sonics I could ever imagine, and the snare, which is why people make fun of me about snares, because I spend so much focus on that, is because of Rumors. And knowing Ken's philosophy after time and hanging out with him, there was no technical alignment. There was a lot of magic in the band, and there was Ken just having the right focus and drive and ears to do what he does. There was no secret trade on achieving what he did. Or maybe there is, but he doesn't know it, and I certainly haven't seen it. I just think that he just has a special touch,
right,
and a magic ear that you can't put down, because it was very different working for Ken than it was kind of underneath Schnee, because Schnee's amazing at, kind of doing something, and there's a philosophy behind it. And I loved that, because I could say, okay, how do I let my mind understand that better? And it takes a long time, 5 years, to get into that headspace and kind of achieve something. With Ken, he's a little more rock and roll. I don't know if that's the right term. Seems like they're both pretty rock and roll, but it was just a little more like, I don't think Ken cared about certain things. And I don't know, that seems so kind of negative, but it wasn't. It's very different, but at the same time, which is why I was so happy to have both guys be mentors in my life, because I got so much out of both of them. And it was just pretty special being able to get such a different casting between the two.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds as if Ken's motivation is to just simply go for whatever the record needs until it's moving. And then when it's moving it just so happens that the snare sounds great. Is that kind of how you're describing it?
Yeah. I mean, it's just more off feeling from both of those men. It's just off of feeling.
Yeah.
There is no hard rules. When I used to think there was all these rules and you have to follow all it, and compression is bad and all this stuff. And then I just realized over time that no one has that. And it's just, Bill's always been pushing that. Like there's no rule. You can dirty things up. Traditionally, sonically is king for me. And I learned that from Bill and Doug. I would say that going after the best sonics and quality as you can is more important. But obviously performance is going to king anything.
Yeah.
So the story goes, and this is a really neat story. Speaking of Rumors and speaking of Dreams, which is the big snare song. And I remember going over the multi-tracks with Ken. We were listening to Dreams, and I'm soloing Stevie's vocal. And I thought it was a scratch vocal because it was the middle of the song and I wasn't focusing. All I heard was bleed on the drums in her vocal mic, and I could hear this kind of sound on the vocals. And I'm like, wait a second, this is the take. Because everyone knows the vocals so well now that you could just, in a second, this is her take. And he's like, yeah, that was the scratch take. She was standing in front of Mick, 5 feet away from the drums, holding an RE20, and it was her scratch, but we couldn't beat it. We tried over the course of a year and we could never beat it. So that became the take. And it's funny because if you listen to the album, there's a punch in the second verse and the snare changes sonics. And that's because it's magic right there in the nutshell. That bleed into her vocal had just enough spit on the snare, on the vocal mic, that when they did the punch in, the snare changed and it didn't feel the same. And then it punched back out into the scratch and it was like, holy crap. Which I'm not saying that's not the only reason, because I could guarantee you Ken or Richard at that time cared about that much of a snare difference. but it was magic how much of a difference that added to the snare alone.
Oh, I can believe it. I mean,
But
haven't you experienced that yourselves or yourself at times when you record drums and you've got a scratch vocal mic and then you go to mute it and all of a sudden something goes away in the drums?
exactly. Which I think Bill used to do. He used to put up these AKG, kind of the cheaper brand condensers up around for talkbacks. And he used to set them up there. And I'm always going, gosh, this guy has like 10 251s and 10 C12s and just almost the same amount of mics as, John McBride has. And he's putting up these crummy AKGs and all these crappy these like $150 condensers. And I'm going, why is he doing that? And then I think he said something at that time is like, I put it up one time and I like the sound of it. And they were talkbacks at the time. So now I just put them up when I'm doing, a specific drum session or whatever, just to have as a side mic, just in case. So yeah, there's totally times like that.
That's so cool. Well, let's take a break here for just a second. We'll come back in for the jam session. Thank you for all those awesome stories, Marc. I'm looking forward to asking you some more questions about this stuff. Rockstars, a reminder, you can find links to what we're talking about in the show notes, or just go on your mobile device and click right through, or go to rsrockstars.com and you can find the blog post there. And I'll have links to all this stuff, including the YouTube playlist, as if we can get a few YouTube videos together to show you this music and some of the trailers we're going to talk about too. So we'll see you in just a moment for the jam session. You've already invested in your studio speakers, headphones, and treatment of the room. And you're passionate about creating great music, but your mixes don't seem to translate to the rest of the world. The reason is that your speakers and headphones are not telling you the whole story. The frequency response of your studio has huge peaks and valleys all throughout the low end that are completely screwing up your perspective. You may be doing your best to hit the bullseye with your mix, but your room makes the target of a perfect mix impossible to find. Wouldn't it feel great if there was a simple tool that could fix all that for you and help you get your mixes right the first time? Introducing SonarWorks Reference 4, the affordable solution to correcting your speakers and headphones in your studio. Built for Windows and Mac, SonarWorks helps you position your speakers, correct your control room imperfections, and get $1 million sound on a home studio budget. Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com and start your journey toward the perfect mix. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Marc Daniel Nelson, joining us from Salt Lake City, talking about making records with all sorts of greats like Bill Schnee and Colbie Caillat. And we're going to talk now about doing things like music for trailers, recording and composing for string sections, and anything else we can think of. So, Marc, you ready to jump in and jam for a bit?
Yes.
Cool, man. Well, so let's just jump into some questions about stuff. Maybe tell us what you're doing there now in Salt Lake, because I know you've got a pretty amazing thing going where you are recording. I think you mentioned getting ready for a 50-piece string section.
Yeah, so there is a studio. Warner Chappell has a studio in Salt Lake City called LA East Studios, and they do a lot of score work for television, movies, and a lot of production music, library stuff. And there's two really great rooms here. There's a big chapel that they're setting up for. I'm not actually on that one. For I believe it's a 50-piece orchestra for either a film or something. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's guys running around right now doing that.
Nice.
And then the other room is a very traditional 70s era kind of built room, very lava rock. I mean, it looks like Westlake, compression ceiling, all that stuff. So you can go get both worlds. So it was cool. We were doing a drum thing about 3 weeks ago, and I had a drum set up in the chapel and then in Studio A. And on the console, I had the chapel and then I had Studio A. And the Studio A drum set was very tight and focused and punchy and very 70s, very kind of that sound, very small, dead. And then I also had the very loud, big Bonham rock setup, and we could go between songs, and we did a full record like that.
That's cool.
And it was amazing to be able to do both sides. So, it was something. I came from LA. Warner Chappell approached me and said, we have this position opening up. Would you have any interest in moving to Salt Lake City? And I was just like, at this time, I mean, I think I just got off one of the best years of my career. And, I have a lot of friends in LA, I had family in LA. I was just like, I don't know. I mean, I've always wanted to do score work and work on orchestra music. And it was a pretty intense last few years at that time. And I was looking forward to kind of indulging myself in the better things in life outside of work. And as much as I liked going to the beach, that was about it for me in California when it came to, I go on hikes and stuff, but it was still always LA, no matter where you would go. And I wanted to start skiing again. And I knew that Salt Lake had one of the best ski resort destinations in the world. And so I started thinking about it. And this was another one of those answers where I could not find a no. I couldn't find a no. There was like everything fit right. And I was at a place in my life where I'm like, I've got to do this. This is going to be a lot of fun. And I've been here for about a year and it's been a lot of fun. I still travel back to LA quite often, a lot. And I've been going back and forth to Nashville quite a lot too for work.
Yeah.
And I found that that's the key. And I think anyone who's smart enough to kind of see that, there's nothing wrong with kind of being away from the element. There's a lot of people in this industry that are doing just fine away from the major cities. I travel into the major cities when I need to do it, and I don't need to be there full time. That doesn't mean I'm not going to live there one day again. It just means in my life right now, it's a hell of a lot of fun going to skiing 18 times like I did last winter at any drop of the hat. 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away from a ski slope right after just mixing a song. It's an amazing feeling.
That's great. Do you drop the mix in your Dropbox and then have it on your earphones as you're coming down the slopes?
Yeah, I've done that. I actually did that last year. I was working on Eric Burdon, I think his most recent song, and I was having a hell of a time trying to get the low end right, and I couldn't get it right. I was in a hurry, and I really want to go skiing that day. And so I printed it. I sent it off to Mariana, Eric's wife, and waited for feedback. And I had it on my phone still, so I was listening to it. And I was driving to the ski place, and then I waited because for me, after mixing, I don't want to hear it right away. A lot of people listen to it in their car, and I feel like when you just spent the amount of time you spend working on something, you need to give yourself subjective distance to be. So I literally paced myself for like 2 hours, but I listened to it on the ski lift. And of course, anything's going to sound amazing when you're physically looking at the beauty of what you see when you're at like Park City, which is these enormous skyscraping mountains and the snow and just the pines and the aspen trees and just anything's going to be great. And I'm just like, this is extra special. Because it was just so much fun.
Well, that's it right there. Now, when you deliver a mix to somebody and you're listening to it from the top of the ski slopes, you should snap an iPhoto and just send that with the mix and be like, just listen to it from the top of the slopes. And it sounded great.
The ski lift approval.
Exactly. Well, so groovy. So tell us a little bit more about doing these big, I know you're not only doing string stuff, you're doing all sorts of things, but you certainly do have experience doing strings.
Yeah.
What capacity have you done? Can you talk about what it means to record a string ensemble too, or give us sort of an outline of an introduction to it?
Sure. So when I started at CRC, they were doing jingles in a traditional fashion, but in a more, they were the king of that. And Chicago being an advertising city, Leo Burnett and some of these other major companies, we would do just these major elaborate sessions where you'd have a full orchestra, a full brass section, and a full rhythm section recording all together at once.
Wow.
And just observing that and assisting some sessions on that time and watching how things were being made, it was really special. But the thing I never got into until like working under Schnee and then working in LA and kind of starting underneath things and working on smaller films, which was the pacing of what orchestra music is compared to, traditional music. So I learned a lot growing up and learning under the jingle world. And I mean, these are like big Disney commercials and stuff that required 25, 30-piece orchestras as well. And there was techniques I took from there, and I learned underneath like Dennis Tusana, who, learned from this amazing other guy, Gus, that was just the king of all kings when it was like tracking fast and learning how to do stuff in speed and quality. And then kind of mirroring that with stuff I learned in LA. And by the time I came to Warner, I probably had done, 550 score dates by that time. And just, I knew kind of what I was doing. I knew exactly the sound I needed to get. Eric Boulanger, I keep mentioning him because he is one of my best friends, was a first caller in LA violinist, and he was always being put on these sessions, and we would always talk about the philosophy of recording these projects and, go to Sony and understand why there is this sonic difference between Sony versus the Fox stage and the Fox stage versus East West, which is a smaller room, and Capitol, which is a smaller room, but there's still sonic characters there. And then I started working with a good friend of both of ours, Brian Carr, who worked on the first Colbie record with Eric and became pals. And he wanted me to work on a film he was working on. And we just started working together on that world. And I just started liking every aspect of production music in general. So if it's placement music in the film or if it's score music, it was just, I don't know. I just wasn't burning out of music like in records, but I was just getting this new appreciation of music context in production music. And I don't know. I remember the first thing we did, the song San Francisco, which is that 60s song. If you're going to San Francisco, we had to do a remake of it because our publishing, I don't think it was approved or cleared for the film. And so we had to do a sound alike. And Brian rented out East West 3, which is the Pet Sounds room at East West. And that was where that original recording of that original 60s song was done. So we did it there, and we hired this band to do this song. And we used the chambers, and we used all 2 mics, and it worked out so well. And I remember seeing it at the premiere, and I'm just like, this is so much more fun. And then making records, I liked making records, but I don't know. There was some excitement about going and seeing it on a screen and like just music in general.
Well, if you're making a record, how often do you get to turn around and look at all those faces that are hearing your record all at once? Whereas in a movie theater, you've got that immediate reaction of the audience.
Well, that's kind of how it started. And then Ken and Michael, who was doing these things at that time, they started this company, Sleeping Giant, which is a division of Alcon Entertainment. And their setup was they were getting first call dibs on placing music to film. So we create new songs for these films and write a lot of end titles for these movies. And I don't know. I just was like, this is so foreign to me, but at the same time, super exciting. So there was this element of going, and this is not just score. This is just like incidental rock tracks that are being played, and you're basically customizing normal music almost as if it's score for the shot, because there's temp music underneath it, and they said we need this in the vein of it. And or the end title is going to be with somebody very well known, and we're going to have to co-write the song with the artist to make it cut right to the end title of the show. And that just seems so much fun. So I started doing it, and we worked with Alcon for 3 years with Ken and Michael. And we did a lot of good stuff. I worked on a lot of really fun stuff, and those payoffs was those moments being at the theater. I mean, I remember we did Point Break. We had like 6 custom songs, including the end title for Point Break. And I thought that was a big movie. As cheesy as the remake was, it was still like $130 million movie. And the budget was just so insane if you put it on paper. And it was, I remember the premiere was at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. And they shut Hollywood Boulevard down. And they had skyscrapers coming down for the premiere. And they had like fireworks shooting off their skyscraper suits and stuff like that. And I'm just like, what is going on? Because everyone remembers this Chinese theater. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
And it was just super surreal. And all of a sudden, they just started jamming out the end title track that we did and produced for the film. And it was just this super weird. I have this video of Ken and I'm taking, these guys are landing on the street, 10 of them with like fireworks shooting off. And I'm just looking at Ken go, what the hell is going on? And then we go and we watch the premiere and, seeing the film and the music that's tying into the story that you've been a part of and worked on. And then, the credits at the end, the excitement. That was just like so much fun to me to make those things. I said, I've got to still do, and it wasn't about the ending. It wasn't about going and getting the approval.
Yeah.
It was more about trying to, create something cool. It wasn't about like, oh, we're going to do this so I can go to this party.
Right.
It was more about, this excitement you felt. So after that whole thing, we worked on a handful, like 6 more movies or something like that. It was time for me to like figure out what I was going to do. I had this hell of a year with working on normal records and working on all these movies and trailers and stuff like that. And Warner came up and said we moved to Salt Lake City. And I said, okay, let's do it. I couldn't find a reason to say no. So I came here and, working on everything from normal traditional music for placement, and specifically when, a movie comes in, then we're scoring for the movie. And that's more traditional of the sense. But I do work through Warner. We do quite a lot of trailer stuff. And there's a company, Glory, Oath, and Blood, that's a partner through Warner Chappell. And they do quite a bit of high profile trailer placement. So inside, it's funny, I do all that stuff, and then I do a lot of outside work as well. And depending on what works, it works. And it's a lot of fun. And I'm kind of more of the guy that the longer and the harder you work, the best things pay off. Mm-hmm. And it's been pretty ridiculous last few years.
So, what more do you want to say about doing trailers for film? I mean, how is that different? Is working towards a trailer different than working on scoring a film? Is it different from making a record with a band in the studio?
Traditionally, are we talking in the sense of trailer music when you're laying it in over a trailer? So
yeah, you educate us. I mean, treat us as if we don't really know much of anything about trailers.
So what I've had experience in the past, and it's probably changed quite a lot from what it used to be. But when I started doing it and working on the films I was working on, we would get, a cut of the trailer. And if we were placing music in it, there was 2 divisions. One is the supervisor is going to pick the music and lay it in. The other one is like what I worked with Sleeping Giant and Alcon, which was literally getting a cut of the trailer and then laying music in to it and customizing music to picture. Now, a lot of people don't do that very much anymore. They just pick the piece from a library. And being able to customize it always lands you in a sharper position because you got exact cue cuts and everything is timed perfectly, and you don't have to guess on picking a song that might be in the wrong tempo or stuff like that. But I've done quite a lot where it's the opposite, where you just, you work on a piece and you put it in a library, and then the supervisor pulls it out from the library and chooses it for what they need it to be. And I think what you're kind of asking, I think the biggest thing is in trailer world, depending on what style of trailer it is. I'll give you a reference. Glory, Oath, and Blood does a lot of like action movie stuff. So I call it the hybrid of metal, EDM, orchestral, and rock. That's the best way I can put it. If you want to put a genre on that, that's what it is. It's sound design mixed with all those genres is what trailer music for me, for that style of film. And that seems like 80% of trailers now are this really over the top. And that's a question for Robert Bennett, but there is probably a philosophy behind what is creating that and what is making people kind of lean to that, which is this like really over the top sound design, heavy rock, orchestral manifest.
Yeah.
But mixing those things, which is what I've been doing, is really tricky. And I think that's why I like it, because it's incredibly challenging. And it's not just like mixing a traditional band or a project, because these things come in at 300-400 tracks at times. Yeah. So many tracks that you can't even, it just takes you a half day just to organize and get into your template. And you're going to fight three things in trailer world. Volume, because people want it as loud as you can. So you're going to have to understand philosophy of compression and distortion and what it's doing, because even I was telling this to Blackbird 2 weeks ago at the Academy, you use the limiter as your distortion because now people are becoming accustomed to that, just like they become accustomed to perfect time drums and auto-tune vocals. So you have to like marry all those kinds of things in there. And unlike traditional rock and roll, where you compress a drum set and that seems more exciting and explosive and big, in reality, in the trailer world, at least from my point of view with working with people and what their feedback is, when I don't compress certain drum elements, it's way more impactful. It's probably because they're already giving me stuff that just sounds huge. So that's kind of one of the nutshell things.
That's very cool. I appreciate you kind of giving us that insight into that. That really helps me sort of visualize what you're doing with that. I mean, just the thought of getting 300 tracks is a little overwhelming. I'm so used to working with bands, still 24, 32 tracks is plenty on a lot of stuff I'm doing. So would you talk a little bit about what a template means? What does a template look like? How should we visualize what a 300 track template might look like?
I set it up. I have one template, and it can be for a jazz quartet. It could be for a score piece of music, or it could be trailer, it could be rock and roll, and it's all one template. And I'm sure a lot of mixers now that have these templates use very similar approach, which is you put everything you need into the session where you can always go back and pull out from what you need. So my template, once you get it set up, 300 tracks isn't as big as it seems. Once you get your groups locked in and everything's in its division, it's actually really simple. It just takes a little time to kind of do the build and make sure your gain stage is correct, because you don't want to get into trouble once you get to that crazy amount. Because, trailer music has so much low end information in it.
Yeah.
There's all these sub drops that have unbelievable amount of 30 hertz, and then bass sub, usually 3 sub layers of 808 hits, and anything from just sub Moog synthesizers, any kind of thing that's putting out square waves that are just attacking the top end, and it's going to bite any kind of transient thing you're going to work with. It's just a big mess. But once you start putting it into, at least for my format, a template that you can physically kind of break down, it gets really simple. And I'll just, I guess, explain that real quick. But
Sure.
if it's a 24-piece band working on a rock and roll song, or if it's a 250-track trailer piece, it's going to be about the same. So I will always group in 3 divisions of drums. There would be drums, which is drums. It's like a traditional drum kit, and then percussion, and then like effects. So all 3 of those are going to be grouped separately, and they will go into 3 separate buses. So I have a bus system laid out that it goes tracks into buses that they are designed to go into mix bus. And then after that, I have a template of like 15 different types of reverbs that are already preset, that I use, and it's all synced internally. So my bus IOs are all labeled, so I have everything exact. And then I have like 3 compression parallel channels I have stuff set up for drums, vocals, bass, guitar stuff. So it's really, really, and they're all dumping down to the 2 bus. Very simple.
So effects, if you have effects that are happening on drums, if you have effects that are happening on vocals, guitars, other instruments, do those typically empty straight to the 2 mix, or do you route effects back in with subgroups for other instruments?
No, they all dump down. It's all like a funnel. It goes straight down to 1, and that's the 2 bus. And there's a reason why I do that, and it has to do with how I print stems when I'm making larger projects. But it's just, I like to see in real time what's happening versus trusting insert buses and stuff that, might be thrown into other channels that you're making unseen bus and template / like stem things that you can't see what it's doing. And a lot of people trust those, and then you just print it. I get a little nervous like that. So I don't mind spending an extra 20 minutes at the end of the session and sit there and print out 8 stems so I can physically see what's going on. But the biggest ideal is, so it's pretty easy. It goes, if you look at after all the tracks that are all color coded to the buses, people usually put buses right after their groups. I keep them all in one bay because that's where it comes up on my console in the digital faders. So I can have everything on their own fader coming up. I have the Schnee Genesis in my room, and I can pull everything up in front of me on the digital faders that are controlled through Pro Tools, and it's all in groups. So when I do my rides, which is a huge part of mixing for me, that it's all together in line versus it being after every group. So it would be drums, percussion, effects, and then I would do bass, then acoustic guitars, which is everything but acoustics. So if it's banjo, mandolin, and acoustic guitars, it's in the acoustic bus, and then electrics are electric. Keys, which is pianos, Rhodes, B3, any kind of traditional keys, and then synths, which is exactly what synth is. And then brass, orchestra, background vocals, and then lead vocals. And then these are essentially my groups, my buses, and my stem breakouts. Exactly. So it just makes it super fast. And each channel has inactive a handful of compressors or whatnot that I know always is my go-to depending on the genre. So give you an example, I will use on drums a different compressor on my bus for drums on a rock track, obviously, than I would on a trailer track, even if the trailer track is rock. It's just, I have a sonic thing I do to kind of go after specific elements, and it's always low end for trailers. It's always focusing on that. So
interesting.
I use a fab filter for trailer work, and the distressor, slate or UAD, they're both excellent for rock or kind of traditional Americana or anything like country on the drum bus.
Really?
And
a distressor across the 2 bus. I mean, the drum bus, rather. That's cool.
Yeah, it's super, very, very limited, like maybe 1 off the top. But it just adds this extra thing, and it seemed to work really well. I've got pretty much the universe when it comes to plugins. It's been really nice to be able to try out stuff. But I found that some things just don't, I don't know, they don't work the same way. And I don't know, I see these things that, like I said earlier, like always learning, constantly learn. I picked up something the other day or something off of a mix with the master, and I'm like, I'm going to try this. And it just stays just because I like the way it sounds.
Yeah.
You know, Andrew Sheps has a lot of cool philosophies that I picked up. Michael Brower has these great things. And there might be one little thing that you just pick up and you're like, that just changes everything. And for my template, I have, you know, EQs and compressors inactive on these buses that will instantly put a sweetening sound towards something. And it's just how you can move around fast. I've been able to kind of lock down and try to figure out how to be as efficient as I can so I can spend more time doing enjoyable things while mixing. And so being able to get ahead with these things that are already engaged, like reverbs that are labeled, and some of the reverbs have presets exactly like I have one specific reverb that is a Fab Filter reverb that is, I think, set on 8 seconds decay, almost infinity
Nice.
At that point. That is the most magical, dense reverb that I've been able to find. I've always tried to figure out, if you listen to like Sea Change and this Beck record, he's got these unbelievable long, dense reverbs. And like I found something equivalent to that finally in the box. I use a Bercasti hardware on a lot of stuff, usually main vocals or score. If it's going to be orchestra, it's the main element, and that's triggered off of a plugin, and that can be fully recalled. But mainly I still use a lot of stuff. Abbey Road's plate, UAD's plate, Vahilla's plate. They're all different, and I have them in line where it's exactly what they are: 140, Abbey Road plate, and Valhalla. And they are so different when it comes to sonics that I can get what I need out of the 3 for plates, and same as all the other reverbs.
I like that philosophy, you know, to just have something that's you might even have 2 of the same plugin with different settings, and each one's just bypassed completely until you want to try it out on something. You just enable it.
I have 3, small room. One's called Small Room, literally. And I think it's just over the years, and like anyone's going to do, they hear records and they wonder how they got reverb like that. And I spent a lot of time with a real 480 growing up and, trying to understand what you hear on records. I was just listening to this, Give My Regards to Broad Street, which is this 80s film that Paul McCartney made in like 86. And it's kind of funny little movie. It was a little quirky. It's a Jeff Emmerich album. And, bless his soul. Gosh, that was sad to hear about Jeff Emmerich. But, listening to it, there's a traditional sense this is an 80s album. The snare is going to have this gated verb thing. But all 3 songs that I love on the record has a very different, small, kind of dense, non-lin reverb tone. And so I was like, what are these tones? So I spent all this time trying to figure out if it's an AMS or a 250, a real 250, or a 224 or 480. And I found that like the Music Club C on the 480 is one of the best drum reverbs I've ever heard. And in fact, the Pro L, or not the Pro L, but the LX 480 plugin sounds great. I actually use the Impulse of the 480. For some reason, I don't know if it has a little more brittleness and it's perfect for the top transient that you get out of a snare to get that thing. But I don't know. I just hunt for those things and I label them exactly what they are. So if I'm listening to a song and I go, oh, this reminds me of Closing Time, Semisonic Closing Time, I'll remember probably it's the tape echo on his vocal, and I kind of have 2 or 3 different tape echoes that I use depending on how they feedback or what they're doing. And I will choose that specific off of that. And I learned that approach from Phil Ramone. He would label Billy Joel's headphone mixes like very generic, like Elvis delay or fun things. Like that wasn't super serious. And I always I like that. So like some of my labels are really quirky, like John Lennon vocals or something like that. Cause there is a difference in my opinion with the tape delay of John Lennon vocal versus Buddy Holly or an Elvis
Yeah, sure.
They just sound different. It's the tape machine that's doing it, obviously, but I kind of catered these specifically. And sometimes you want the Elvis or the Johnny Cash echo more than the John Lennon Beatle echo. And so but you need to be able to know the difference between the two. And that's how I make mixes. I kind of reference something that's making me feel and pull influences out of those. And I have it all locked into a template. So I can just have fun. And it's like literally pulling something up and then adjusting the tempo to a delay, and you're rolling. It's awesome.
What are some tricks or advice you have for the best way to store your template so that it's available on the next thing you work on? For example, I've tried creating a template and then start from that and drag tracks into that. I've tried opening a song and having everything the way it was when I was recording it, and then I import the Pro Tools stuff over from the last song I did. I'm guessing you try a little bit of everything. Have you found just sort of clever ways to organize this stuff so that you're not kind of having to undo a bunch as you try and use it each time?
I think the key is to always evolve. So like anything in life, when you arrive, you're dead. So with templates, I try to change it constantly, but I always save the old version. So if I still use September 2017 to this day, nice. Which is every month I'll kind of change it up and I have a folder of the backlog of what I use. And obviously if I'm in an album and I'm going into song 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 are killer, might as well start fresh with those and import from song 1 as my main template. So I have it labeled where, like I said, drums through lead vocals are going to be always the same. And my routing's always the same. So in my template, everything is labeled identical. My IO is identical. So all it takes is I have the Pro Tools session, import the data, and go in with it. But sometimes I'll go and start from track 1 after track 1 turned out great and import that data. But it's always laid out the same as every project. So, and I have asterisks and capitals for my buses. So I know exactly on the session import what is what, and they're always in line. So it always goes from drum, DRM, asterisk, all the way down to mix to print. And print is actually the print, internal, in every session. And I still use hardware compressor for the insert on the 2-bus 80% of the time, not everything. And there's no reason why I don't do it every time. It's just depending on the day. I have the access to use a handful of outboard compressors still, so I like to use it when I can, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So same as like the other buses, my 2-bus has every bank filled with specific plugins that I use that are inactive. And I only use 1 or 2 at the very end. And one of them can be an insert of the hardware, and then one can be the glue plugin that I like really a lot, which is the SSL emulation. I like that better than the Waves and the UAD, to be honest. And
the one stuff from SSL, the Duende?
No, it's actually glue. And it was Simtonic is the company. And I've gone back to it a lot because I have everything else as well. And I would compare stuff, but there's something about this that does, I don't know if they added some kind of transformer-esque EQ that would create a little bit of a density thing. It creates a little thickness. And that's a little different. But in general, it's like I have 3 different tape simulations that I wouldn't even use 80% of the time, but they're just there because I know that they're character changers in the template. So I'm just trying out new things to create tone. And that's what I was saying earlier about like being internal. You have all these options to just try stuff. And everyone has the same tools. And I thought that was so exciting when you're going after all these guys and you're shooting out and you're trying all these projects out where everyone else is using virtually the same plugins as you.
Yeah, it really puts the responsibility on your shoulders, doesn't it?
I kind of enjoyed that. I kind of liked knowing that we're all using the same reverbs and same plugins. And, I have I've got a lot of hardware in my room, but I don't really use it very much. And that's just because there's something self fulfillment I get when I can really do well without using a box that costs $4,000.
Yeah.
That's just being an insert for a compressor that's only tapping at 0.5 dB. And you're going, that's $5,000. And so there's still something so special about hardware, but at the same time, there's something really cool when you can just nail it without it and just use software. And it happens more time than not when you're just doing that.
Do you find that in order to have many tracks, to be able to have all these plugins available and have this flexibility, that you have to have a real top-of-the-line powerful computer? Or is this stuff that we might do even without having the latest and greatest Mac, for example?
I mean, I think I have one of those cheese grater Macs. It was a 12-core.
Yeah.
It has HDX on it, but that's not powering any plugins. I think it powers maybe one, because it's not a TDM software anymore. It's whatever the AAX is. And I think I have one or two, some plugin alliance stuff that I don't even run in AAX. So nothing's really bussing off that. I think laptops now are strong enough. I don't know, but like going after the same thing about my bussing process, I don't do a ton of processing on individual channels anymore. Maybe on the kick and snare, maybe on the toms, just a little bit. Nothing on bass, and very little on individual guitars and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's just all going in buses that are creating, the big amount of character shift. And that doesn't take a lot of processing when you're talking about 12 stereo tracks.
That's a good reminder, good tip too.
It just keeps things kind of very simple, but it's also doing a collective amount of EQ versus, 13 layers of EQs. I would rather have one thing do one big EQ than 5 things doing little EQs. But the weirdest thing, I think I'd rather have a compressor doing 5 little compression than one thing doing a crap load of compression if I'm trying to get a softness out of it. So,
is there anything that you find that you do often across all tracks? For example, do you find that you're always including a low cut and manipulating that to really carefully carve out what's going on with the low end? Or are you always throwing up a trim plugin so that you can check phase against different things?
I think phase is my biggest ally. Referencing an album that I did that I was shooting out against 3 pretty big mixers. This was back in 2013. It was one of my first up against 2 or 3 people I really respected. And there was an album by an artist in Canada, and she really wanted these 2 other people to mix. And luckily I was at the end of the line because the producer knew who I was, and I worked with him, and he's like, hey, if you want to take a stab at this, this is the time, because they just turned in their mixes. So I got their mixes, and they both were like,
that's a great cheat too, isn't it?
Yeah. It was really, I was in the session and I had the artist's rough mix, so I knew where she was hearing it. And then I had the 2 guys that I really liked underneath my print track. And at this time, this was right when I started my template. And I'm going back and forth and I'm going, man, these are both really good. And I'm trying to get closer. And I'm like, I can't beat it. I don't know what to do. So I'm going in my head going, I have to be different, because it's not just going to, no matter what, the superstar name is going to win unless it's super different. And then you're just a wild card at that point. And that's what you have to kind of think out of the box. And I'm going, how the heck do I separate myself when everything is super well recorded, so everything sounds great? So it's not like you get something kind of crappy and you start adding all your own samples into it, because it certainly didn't need it. It had really, 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 really well recorded sounds on it. And I'm going, okay, I'm going to start fooling around with phase. That's the only thing I could think of that's going to shift sonic character way over a tape emulation, way over a console, way over any of that stuff. I'm going to have to start shifting that, because we all used the same tracks. So the DI and the bass amp was the culprit and the catalyst to me getting this album, which was these other guys kept whatever they had in line for the DI and the sub of the amplifier, and it was this really good bass sound. And I'm like, I'm going to be radical, and I'm going to throw the amplifier out of phase to the DI, which dropped the octave immensely of the low end and it possibly even really put it out of phase, but it made the sonic of the whole thing change so much. There was so much sub, but there was not a lot of low mids. So there was like a scoop to this, like really, really cool thing just by switching the phase on that. And I'm like, that's it. So traditionally my mix sounded very similar. The other two guys used very similar reverbs that I would have chosen to use on the vocal because the sound was pretty straightforward. So you kind of knew where you were going to go with it. You can't get super radical. But my low end was super different. So all the meat in the low mids was super strong. So the snare got way bigger in the mix because there was not a ton of low mid or low mid of the bass. It was just super, super sub and like 800 hertz, which is all the kind of fret noise. That was it. That was it.
That's so cool. And I want to ask, what sort of monitoring situation were you in that made you feel confident about shifting the octave down low like that and everything? Did you have anything particularly special going on with your monitoring, or was it just, a pair of NS10s and a mono sub, or what sort of situation were you in?
No, at that time I've always been fighting low end, and the thing I learned from Bill Schnee was, I don't know if he's ever said this, but I've always learned from him, which is just trust low end. Like, trust the bass. It's going to be, okay. I never saw him do an aggressive amount of EQ on bass guitar, but he always had the absolute most low end out of anything I've ever heard when it came to bass. And a lot of that's just the gain of where you put the bass guitar in the mix. But, I've heard a lot about a lot of people in Nashville and a lot of traditional things. I think Jeff Emmerich was teaching this, which is the VU meter trick, where if your kick is here and then once your bass hits, you should be at 0 VU. I didn't do that. I just usually just kind of trusted what I was hearing. And I started not touching the bass. I would compress it and I'd add a little bit of 800, but I would never cut it out. I used to see people just cut the crap out of low end of bass guitars, and that really mangles stuff out. And I guess it was just learning from Bill. And then when I started getting records mastered by Doug Sachs, he wouldn't touch the low end. He would never put a filter in at the bottom. And I would always be like, are you sure this is okay? And I'm thinking, why am I even asking this guy? Not only is he the king of quality, he's also monitoring on ATC 150s with subs. I mean, there's just no way if it was bad, he would not change it. So I think that started becoming a part of my signature sound, as you would call it, just an immense amount of thick low end. And people always seem to like that. And that was a big rule I learned up from the beginning, which is trust the low end. And I don't know how to trust it because I still, even to this day, don't know how to trust it. And I work on ATC 45s with a big Genelec sub for trailer stuff. And I'm like, I think this is good. And I always get a thumbs up at the end, but I listen sometimes. I'm like, this seems a little over the top, but maybe that's what people want, the little over the top. So when I did that record, it was just a pair of twins with no sub, but it created such a tonality shift, even on the speakers that small, that it was worth it. And then I sent it to Eric at the mastering lab before it went up to Katie, the artist.
Good thinking.
In Canada. And I said, just check this. I always know. And he's like, I didn't touch the low end. He never touches. Maybe he'll add 20 if he's trying to get some kind of harmonic thing. But it's funny. I used to read all these things about all these guys are putting bumps at 110 and 120 for their low end. And I'm thinking, gosh, they're just skipping. They're missing all this 20 and 30 hertz, which really does show up even in a smaller speaker. You just have to apply it better. You can't just be radical and just add 20 hertz on a bass guitar because you think it's going to work.
That's fascinating, man.
I don't know.
Well, so let me dig into a little bit about recording. How do you like to prepare for a recording session, and what comments do you want to say about recording drums? What are some things you really enjoy about recording a live drum set?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it's microphone choice, and then room, and then preamp / compression. It's obviously the player is number one. I found that if you can have a great player, you can get away with anything, and you'll always sound better than what you actually are doing.
Yeah.
I always feel like I'm cheating when I have a really good drummer in a good room, even before microphones. And that's it. I mean, I spent years trying to figure out how to get all these amazing drum tones, and then I started working with better drummers, and then that was it. It was just by the time you do that, it just becomes freakishly easy. And then I think you still need that training to push yourself to the max, because you have to be ready when you get that call. So I think a lot of it is, always in that order: playing, then the drummer, and then the room, and the preamp, microphone choice, all that stuff down the line. I would always use 2 microphones on overheads if I can.
Mm-hmm.
It was something that, I don't know, I saw Schnee do with 251s, or the Sheffield Lab mic of choice, which is super, super rare, or C12s, and it always worked when I did it too. Every time I put a German mic up, or a Flea, which is an unbelievably good clone of those mics, it just works out, and it sounds what I hear in my head. And Glenn Johns or not, I will choose between the 2, one overhead, one on the side like a Glenn Johns, or just 2 on the overheads. They can be very different sonically, but I like ribbons on overheads sometimes, but I don't know. I always feel like it's different. It's softer. Putting Coles up there, or the Beyer, what are those? The 160s.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the Beyer 160s, the M160s.
The hyper. Yeah.
Is that supposed to be when the levee breaks overheads or something like that?
Is that what those are? Yeah. I mean, those are the mic. I remember Dennis Tusana, who was my mentor at CRC, had a pair of those, and he was always very passionate about using them. Plus, on top of it, if you have smaller rooms, these are great because they're super hyper. So they're really, really, really focused cardioid ribbons. I think they're cardioid, but they are hyper. So they're really they really limit, and they're really smooth, but they definitely sound different. I don't feel like I get the same punch that I would out of a tube condenser mic. So I tend to use that. Same as pianos. I tend to use large diaphragm, C12s or something on a piano.
What are some thoughts about piano? Because we do record that here. I've found that pianos are surprisingly one of the harder instruments to figure out how to record, kind of like drums. Do you have some, do you have maybe 3 different ways to mic a piano that could be educational to us?
Sure. So the traditional, if you're on a grand traditional sense, there's, depending on what you're going after, I mean, you could use a pair of 57s and it's great on an SM or a C7. Who would ever use a pair of 57s on that? But, that piano is so clean and punchy and bright that it might really work out really well, trying to dumb it down. Traditionally, kind of where I learned, it was always 2 right over the hammers, 2 C12s right over the hammers. And Schnee used to put a belly mic underneath the C7 at Schnee Studios. And he did that, I think, for a couple of reasons. One was he was trying to get it a little more body, or compared to his Steinway, which was out in the live room, maybe a little, harder sound or a little different sound than just the clean hammer and things. Because piano he had was so unbelievably perfect. There was times I'm like, this sounds like a freaking keyboard. So I think there was other ways to kind of make that sound a little less pretty that you can just have on a third mic.
Now, what would you do with those C12s? Would you open the lid all the way? Would you have them sort of doing a ORTF or a XY, or just sort of looking straight down?
I would just, like I learned, I would just put them over the hammers about 1.5 feet up with the lid all the way open. And depending on the piece, if it's just a pop record, I would never even use a room mic. Mm-hmm. I know that's the same thing as like a Leslie. I see all these guys put bass frequency microphones down at the belly of the Leslie. And I'm like, you guys are cutting that off anyways. Yeah. So I never do that on Leslie's, no matter what, unless it's like clearly a 3-piece band. There happened one time where the band, he was playing bass notes off pedals off the Leslie and had to have the low end. And that was the only time I've ever mic'd a Leslie at the belly and kept it. So same as piano, like I like to add certain things. I did this thing where we have this 9-foot grand here, call it the Frankenstein way, because in fact, it's this really special, bizarre piano. It was this Samick body with Baldwin action and a Steinway harp on the inside. It's this weird piano. And I remember walking in the first day and seeing the word Samick on the side and go, oh gosh. Just because, you're snobby when you work with Bosendorfers or Steinways or larger C7s. There's a C7 in the other room, but what we had in the chapel here, there's this big Frankenstein way. And it's one of the best sounding pianos I've ever heard. It's stupid unique sounding and very, very big. And sometimes it's too good because it has these great combination of all these different things on it. And usually, traditionally, if I have a pair of C12s over the hammers, I'll put one Coles just almost right up to the belly of the piano. So it's
underneath.
Not underneath. I meant like open, right where it's opening, where the mouth of the piano is opening up.
I see.
So it's like 2 feet back. It's not traditionally a room mic, but it's just something else. And I call that my Ethan Johns mic. I don't know why, but it reminds me of if you listen to Ray LaMontagne, when you listen to Ryan Adams, like the 29 album, where there's I can't remember what song, but the piano is a mono mic all the way to the right.
That's because he used the Coles a lot on that record.
Well, maybe that's why, because it's exactly that sound. I mean, I literally just say I keep that because depending on the song, you might only need a mono on the piano, and depending on how you're going to do it, that will always get that sound. No matter what preamp or no matter what compressor. It's the same as why I put it at the back of an orchestra. It's this mono thing that does magic. Even though I'll use M50s on a Decatree on an orchestra, there's a Coles mic I put at the very back at the center facing the conductor in the dead center dialect of where the orchestra wraps. That just picks up and has this sound, which is a Coles sound that I need so much. And I just pop it into the middle, making sure that the phase is as strong as it can be. And it always sounds great. It's just cool. This weird thing. And it works on piano. I always wanted to try it on other elements like guitars and stuff, but I get really lazy. And I don't know.
Well, so
I just get lazy.
When you talk about making sure the phase is as strong as it can be, what does that really mean to us? Does that mean just checking polarity, or does that mean actually moving timing on some of our individual mics sometimes to tighten up the phase?
Well, that can be two things. So on the later of what you were saying, so if we're recording, let's say an orchestra, and we're doing a couple passes, so we have 40 or 30 piece orchestra, but we want it to sound like a 100-piece orchestra. You do a couple passes, and the Decatree, which is the center tree of 3 microphones, left, center, right. When you double that, if you just use the same position, the room kind of gets a little phasey. It just kind of sounds a little strange. It doesn't sound, it's just kind of chorusy. It's not very, you can just tell you're trying to make it layered. It's like double tracking, but with these players, they're so very good at what they do, it starts getting phasey. And so you have to add elements to that. So I have a template trick that I do between those room mics, between each take. So it adjusts timing a little bit, and it adjusts the spread into a stereo spread just a little bit too.
So in other words, the recording would be the Decatree in the same position. So it's more of a mixed treatment. To
I know a lot of guys will set up different mics, and that's fine. I don't know if that's going to do it enough for me, but what I've found and what I've learned from some pretty great people in California, that you use specific time alignment plugins, just very soft, like 20 milliseconds, even 5 milliseconds would set it apart. And then this Waves Vitamin, which is this really interesting widening thing, and you do it incredibly subtle. And it's just enough where it gets past that for phase. So you can kind of do layers a little tighter where it sounds like a bigger place, not just two people playing over the top of each other.
So
now,
cool.
on the other hand is what you were saying, which is phase in general. So like the mono mic in the back, it's always trying to add density to the score or density to the orchestra. And that's low, mid, kind of big fatness that can do. So if I'm pulling the fader up and down and it's getting thicker and thinner when I take it out, obviously that sounds like in phase of what I want it to be.
Right.
If it's hollowing it out, that means it's out of phase. So I'm going for it to be bigger for that case.
I think that's a good reminder about how to listen for phase too, is the power of muting, the power of just simply turning a fader down, and you listen to a sound and then you just pull something out and you just listen for that kind of tonal shift in there to see if it's better or worse. And that helps you know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Same with the bass and the bass amp, between the DI and the bass amp too. Sometimes when I'm trying to determine if the phase is right, slide up the amp fader into the mix and listen to see if the whole tone of the bass sort of shifts to this other place.
Right. But then that's how I did the radical thing, which is traditionally you don't want it to do that. And then this one did. I mean, it literally separated so much where I hollowed it out and I'm like, this is it. We're going to do this. This is going to be the bass sound. So that goes back to no rules or no rules, obviously.
Yeah. All right. Well, so now one last question about specific stuff. You have a great website, which is marcdanielnelson.com. So Rockstars, I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well, or just go straight there. But I wondered, Marc, if you want to talk about, how important it is to have a website. What does it mean? How did you come up with a website? What advice would you like to share with the Rockstars about really upping their game as where it comes to having a really good website?
Sure. So I will be the first to admit there's sections of that website that hasn't been changed in 5 years. And then there's parts that I update probably every 6 months to a year. I think the key thing is we all live in a generation now that you have to be a parent. I'm one of the few people that doesn't use social media at all. And that's just me because I have a problem with social media in general and how it seems to change people's personalities into weird places. So I started a long time ago not getting in on that. And that's probably hurt me pretty ridiculously, but I don't know if it did because I seem to be fine without it. So I said, okay, how am I going to do this without that? I better come up with a website that has everything about me at all times. So if it means a history of what I've done for the last 15 years, obviously work content, any kind of thing I could lay out in a format, it would be great. The trick for me was when I was designing the page, I designed that whole thing off the influence of going, I have to figure out a way to showcase the three things that I do very well. One is engineering, producing, and music. That's one. The other thing is I'm very good at being a control freak, which I call creative direction, which is basically completely separate than music, which is traditionally producing content for television or doing video series and stuff like that. And then the other one is video stuff. And how do you even present that in the nutshell of saying what you do? So you create the patterns and you always showcase your work. I don't know. Like I said, I've changed the cover of my site maybe 3 times. And every time I change it, I wish I could go back and keep what I had. But I know you have to keep moving forward. A note to everyone out there, social media is probably very smart. I'm just a moron for not doing it. I would suggest always make sure you take claim and credit for everything you do. Be very honest with what you say you do and how you do it. Never embellish. Everyone will know if it's not really what you do. Don't try to put stuff on your site that's kind of leaning on, not right if you didn't really do what you said you did. People will see it and then they'll be turned off instantly. That's the biggest thing. I see a lot of people put content on their site that it doesn't matter. Like, I mean, oh my gosh, as an assistant, I worked with so many amazing people and I would have I still have a hard time putting that out of like when someone said, who have you worked with? And I wouldn't go there even though I had larger names as an assistant. You just don't do that kind of stuff. You learn to never embellish, even if it's like something you do. But what you need to do is always take claim with stuff that you know for a fact you did.
Yeah.
No matter what. And don't worry about it if you feel like, if you know you did it, you did it. And that's the thing. But don't try to pull a fast one when people don't see that. Yeah. So I would say for the website, for me, was I tried to showcase. We were talking earlier today on the phone about like the span of kind of genres of what I got into as a mixer. Because as a mixer, you kind of take on, there's one kind of guy that does one style and then they stick. And then there's someone like me that kind of does everything. The last PMA thing I got, the award was, the win was on a hip hop album. And I haven't mixed a hip hop record in 5 years for real. Like that's the one genre I don't really do a lot of work in. But I mean, I love everything from score to rock to Americana to country. I don't like listening to country, but I really like mixing it. Even the Christian stuff that's very Nashville sounding, the players just are super, super good. There's just an incredible amount of content in there. It's just very, very well recorded, very well produced albums. And so it's like across those genres, they all kind of swime into each other a little bit. So I just try to take as much as I can. And when I started my site, I noticed no one was doing that. Like no one was putting out, this is the original content I had back in 2009 when I built the first site for the Alley, which was showcasing genre points. And I had a rap section and a dubstep section and all these sections I really didn't do much work in, but I still had them there from one project that I thought was good. But a lot of it was going into, pop, acoustic, rock, jazz, blues, traditional. All these things had different genres, and people that were going to hire you could go exactly to their genre and hear 5 selections of what you do versus going.
And you have that now with the mixing for music section. It's really beautiful the way it's laid out, all these things, and exactly that. You just go click on one and see what it sounds like for indie pop or R&B.
Right. I feel bad because that hasn't been updated in probably 5 years, 6 years.
Well, that's all right. It's not like you forgot how to mix all those, right?
Right. They turned out pretty good. But that was that section, and there's some other sections. But, the biggest thing is, like, be honest to yourself, own what you do, always accept credit when it's offered no matter what, and never take no for an answer. I mean, I just can't keep saying that. I've been told no my entire life when it came to recording, and it's not going to work out, and it's just not going to happen. It's just too hard, and the industry is gone, and it can be further from the truth. I've only gone up the last 18 years. Yeah. I've never gone backwards since I started, ever.
Well,
so
I agree with that too. I feel like there's been one constant message from starting recording to now. And somebody will always talk about how the music industry has changed. It's just not the way it used to be. Are you sure you want to do this? And
exactly,
and it like you said, just don't take no for an answer.
Exactly. It's just, even when you're trying to get in, take every opportunity you can. I have done so unbelievable amount of free work. Yeah. And I've never, ever, ever thought I was too good or my title is beyond doing free work. I still do a ton of pro bono work because I always try to give back to anybody that emails me, and I give them my normal rate, and they're like, I can't even do an album for that one song rate. And if I really like their music and I talk to them and they're really good people and they're just really appreciative personality, I want to help people out as much as I can. If I have the time and it's going to be enjoyable to me, I would love to help people out. So I really try to do as much as that still, and it always pays off. I hear a lot of people say that's a negative way of working. And I said, I've never messed up doing that. It's always better to give to people than to take. Always. And that's why, I've always been totally fine with sitting with anyone I can. I've had, a handful of assistants the last 5 years that probably leave with a pretty good sense of how they were going to start. And it's because I've sat with them and showed them everything I've been taught. And I'm always okay with giving any information out to that. I've done videos for Guitar Center and Universal Audio and Vintage King and all these places. And they say, okay, you want to give us your tricks? Some people don't want to do that. I said, why? What are they going to steal? Like, if they're able to be that good, they're going to beat me. Great, because that's the only way I was able to get ahead, was to be better. So that's why it's a competitive market.
And like you said, we all have the same tools these days. Exactly.
It's all the same, so obviously learn your headphone or your speakers, but it's always going to be different. I mean, people ask if I'm mixing on a console because it sounds like there's something different. And I'm like, no, because I hear records and I'm like, I can't do that. I don't know how they're getting it to sound specific ways. A lot of rough mixes come in and there's this overall character thing that I'm always like, how did they get that? And I might not like it, but I want to know how they got it, because I don't know how to do that. My head doesn't wrap around that. Ken Caillat used to make jokes because he was the king, and I'll say this out loud, and I hope he's listening. He was the king of putting snare drums 10 dB louder than a vocal. And I started doing that off that measure. And people always be like, can you just turn it down just a little bit? Just the snare, just a little bit. And then it became my sound, and then everyone was okay with it. So a lot of people were embracing the loud drums and became, oh, okay, that's his sound. And I remember mixing, God, I don't remember what we were doing. I think we were doing a Fleetwood Mac reissue, and Ken's like, this is really good, but can you bring the drums down 5 dB? Then it'll be a record. And I'm looking at him, he's joking, but at the same time I'm going, what are you talking about? Like, that's the sound. Mick Fleetwood is like the center of that band. And it's just like, that's the sound. And there's something to that where like everyone else wants to tuck stuff underneath and be gentle and like, oh, it's got to be quote unquote glued. No, it doesn't. It's the same as low end. Be dangerous. Open up that low end octave stuff. Because you look at stuff on and you're like, there's nothing going on below 80 hertz on most records these days, unless it's electro pop or something that has that kind of sound. Be different. Push it. Push the envelope. Distort. Break stuff. There's no rules. I used to think that there's all these rules and don't use compressors and it's got to be this and don't use EQ because that's how I was, always thought, clean is better. And it's like, take that and then run with it and try to marry it with something else where you are using something. That's, I think, why parallel is so cool, because you can do both and just combine the two. Yeah. You can just destroy it with EQ where, 40 decibels of 10K. I mean, can you imagine what that sound like by itself?
Probably. But then I probably don't have to. I've probably done it by accident.
Right. I probably don't even know because I probably can't even hear that high anymore. But I'm just saying, like, just adding that little bit. It's just, it's great. So I just say there's no rules. Records are just records. Doesn't matter.
I like your advice of, making bold moves. And I think for any of us, when we just take the time to think about all the artists and records that have really moved us, if we pay attention, we'll notice that they all made bold moves with what they did.
Real quickly, saying to that, there's something to that. Like, I go back in the last 10 years, I've kind of gone backwards and listened to all the records I really liked growing up. And all the ones I loved, most of them sounded like crap.
Me too.
Now there was elements that I would go, man, I wonder if like Bob Clearmountain would have mixed this or Schnee or someone like in that matter. And I would go, you know what? No way. I mean, there's records, I'm thinking of a couple of 90s records in particular that were heavily handed in an SSL and a Sony Dash, that sound was just all over it. And that has such a specific sound. And a lot of those problems back then, there was no low end on anything, and there was just a weird balance of things. And you listen to the record, and you're like, gosh, that thing sounds terrible. Then you go, what would this sound like really good? No, it's almost like the Walmart of production or something. That's the scary thing we're getting into now, is now that everyone is using the same plugins and the same reverbs, they're also using the same samples. So all these traditional, really beautiful samples with it, either orchestral samples or drum replacement samples, it's all becoming very clean and simple, and that's great. But like, there was something, what was the pack? There was a couple like I think Aaron Sterling, who's this awesome drummer I got to work with a lot in LA, maybe 3 or 4 times. He was really great at creating a vibe when he would play. And I think he did a sample pack with That Sounds, and his samples are just cranking with distortion and stuff. And they're just got some super character. And I'm going, this is great until you start hearing that specific kick or snare on a record. Then everyone's going to find out, and then everyone's going to have this sound. So what I would say in the future, when you're moving forward and making records, build sounds. That's what they do in movies. Yeah. They don't use the same sound design sounds. They go out and create it. So if you can, use the snare going through a really crappy tape recorder, like really get vibey stuff going on. Use some spring reverbs you would never buy. Cheap stuff that you would think, oh, it's too crappy. But that's what's going to keep you different. And try to find that out of anything you do. So like usually if I'm doing a snare sample, which I have almost on anything I work on now because it's specific to what I'm going after, it's always an augment too. It's only 30% up. But I always add distortion to it, or I pulverize it, or I do something so like it's very different that you would never know what that snare is going to sound like before it. And I think that's a Chad Blake trick. I mean, I know he was the SansAmp king.
Yeah.
And he would use that and create a lot of that vibe off that. But that's the thing. He's one kind of guy that would always push no phase or phase, doesn't matter. I don't care. It's how it sits inside something. So when you're choosing these samples, be creative, use your own sounds, always have a secret weapon that's going to stick out different than anything you know. Because that's how it's the same as anything. Create a brand. My brand is snare too loud, vocal too loud, bass too much in my mind. And then I turn it in and everyone's happy. So,
well, even just going to your website, go to the About page, and it started playing some music that just reminded me of Rumors. And my first thought was, I was like, man, that snare sounds great.
Oh, that was Fleetwood Mac. That was when we did the reissue for Mirage.
Oh, cool.
Gypsy is on there, but that was my favorite song growing up. So it was a weird thing of being able to do the reissue and work on the and remix that song.
Wow.
So I just was like, Ken, I'm going to put this on my website without vocals. He's like, okay. And they're like, it's okay. So we're doing it. So it's still on there. And that's why it sounds like Fleetwood Mac, because it is Fleetwood Mac.
Awesome.
That's the one benefit of being able to kind of open up stuff that it's like looking back at multi-tracks of the Beatles and stuff. You go in and you're like, that's it. Because you're soloing things and you're going, these songs your entire life, everything about it. And then you solo the instruments and you're like, this doesn't sound, it sounds great, but it doesn't sound as good as you think it was going to sound in your head. When you solo out, I remember listening to Lindsey Buckingham's acoustic guitar on solo when we were doing a reissue. And I'm like, that's it? Doesn't even sound, but like you put it in the song and you hear it on the radio, or you hear it at a grocery store and you hear this chimey acoustic. You're like, how the hell did they do that? And then you just realize it was a great guitar played by a master of a guitar player, recorded very well by Richard and Ken Caillat.
Yeah.
Richard Downshire. So there was like all these things that go into play. And then when you solo things out, I think everyone kind of has probably got their hands on the Sgt. Pepper stems.
Yeah. That's pretty remarkable to hear that.
Yeah. I remember that was the first time I heard that. I was like, whoa, God, John is super out of tune. You put him in, you're like, oh, there it is. Okay, that's great. I like that.
Or you take it and you go like, oh, I'm gonna remix this. And then you go, well, what am I going to do with it?
Exactly. I remember the first week of having it and I'm going, oh, I'm going to do all this stuff. There was a funny story to that. We were doing the Fleetwood Mac reissue, and as a joke, I put slate kick and snare replacements on everything. And Tom, so it was like really over the top, like Chris Lord Alge sounding, over the top drums. Just as a joke on the first playback for Ken when he came in to listen to the first playback. And he just looks at me like, what the hell did you do to the drums? Because it was so different. And there was like, you would never think of a Fleetwood Mac record being done in that vein of having like anthem snares and all this like super compressed kick and all this stuff. So it's definitely fun to kind of get a little goofy.
That's great, man. Well, we've been going for a good long stretch, so we should wrap up now. But I do have one more question I want to ask you, Mark.
Yes.
This one's hypothetical. You may have already answered it, 10 times in the interview, but if you could take the Wayback Studio machine and go back and find young Mark and give yourself one bit of advice, you say, this is the single most important thing I want to let you know to be a rock star of the recording studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself?
Never take no for an answer and never say no when asked.
Nice.
That's it. That's the only way I could think, because I've made some sacrifices in life that I look back going, I wish I would have handled it differently, but you got to trust how things work out. I didn't move a couple times. There was job opportunities, albums that I could have done in different cities and stuff that I didn't take that became successful, and I regret that. But I would say this world that the engineer, producer lives in, mixer lives in, is fueled by two things, talent and luck. And luck is 90%. So when those opportunities come up and you say yes, it's just because you did the other work, which is getting yourself ready for that yes. Mm-hmm. So just saying yes all the time and putting a worth on yourself is more important than, avoiding things and trying to only stick at certain things. I used to see a lot of engineers skip work because their rate wasn't being matched or something. And I always looked at them like, what the heck is wrong with you? Like, we just got to sit at home and you're not going to make anything now. And that was the difference. They were so worried that their brand was going to be shifted if it got out that they did it for half rate or something. And I did it the opposite way. I just always worked. And if I really loved the band, I would do whatever I could to make it work with them. And it only paid off in the long run. And now it's like I rarely have to deal with that kind of stuff because I don't know if it's just working your way in. But like I said, when you say no, there's something to that.
Well, it sounds like your philosophy is a great way to approach it today too, because, not to join the crowd, but the music industry has really changed from when I started, or from when we started. So I do think that hustle is really important.
It's true. And always try to do your social media. I'm always going to make a little joke about that, but it's until it doesn't work for me, I'm fine doing what I do. But I think a lot of people that haven't had the opportunity to get out there and have the contacts that they can get, it's just meet as many people. Can you hear my dog? He's snoring.
No, but that's good to know.
He's snoring on the side right here. To just meet as many people as you can and take as many opportunities as you can. And I still feel like I'm adding whatever I can in a assistant intern level, meaning I will take out the trash if it needs to be taken out. I will prep my own sessions, even though I have a couple guys that are willing to do it in my building at all times. I don't know. There's something to it. It's like never give up off those. I don't know how to explain it. Just try to be as positive as you can. Take everything you can. Never say no, and always take no as a yes, even if it gets you a little bit in trouble. To that point, don't be an assistant. Someone said, don't talk, and then you start talking, and an assistant will get killed for that.
Right.
I'm talking in terms of someone saying, oh, you can't make that sound better. And then you go, oh, yes, I can, because you said no. And that's more important to me to prove you wrong than it is to make this song sound better. And that kind of mindset, that drive has really pushed me. And that's the best advice I can get, I think.
That's great. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. It's been an absolute blast hanging out with you. And I have to say, man, you have really, really come ready to share all kinds of great insights and stories. So we really, really appreciate that. Let the Rockstars know, please, how they can find out more about you online. Where would you like them to go?
Well, like I said, social media in my universe isn't really important, but in the reality of things, everyone has to have something. So I would say if you're wanting to kind of learn a little more about Warner Chappell studio that I'm working out of, what they're doing, because we do a lot of really cool things, I would visit laestudios.com and then my site for my information or anything about me or what I've been doing. Go to marcdanielnelson.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Rockstars. A reminder that I'll have links to everything we're talking about in the show notes. Just go through on your mobile device and you can click right through. We've got some YouTube's videos there, definitely from some film trailers and things like that. And we'll see if we can add more to that as well. And Marc, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Thank you so much. Dude, it's a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you again. And who knows, maybe we'll go skiing one day.
It's always about skiing.
It should be.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome, dude. Thanks. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.